Good afternoon, and welcome to the Fall 2022 Daynard Community Lecture. Twice a year, the Daynard Distinguished Visiting Fellows Program brings nationally recognized public interest leaders to campus. These public interest leaders serve as role models for our students, demonstrating how legal skills can be used effectively and creatively to make the world a better place. The fellows each year deliver an address that focuses on the strategic use of law to promote public interest goals, participate in a roundtable with other prominent public interest advocates, visit classes, consult about professional opportunities for students and graduates, and meet individually with interested faculty, administrators, and students. We so deeply appreciate the generous support of Professor Richard Daynard, our very own Dick Daynard. He was asked some civil prose questions on the way in here, so he's like doing double duty today, as well as Carol Daynard. Making this series possible. Thank you very much. So, it is my great pleasure to introduce our Fall 2022 Daynard Public Interest Visiting Fellow, Anjali Waikar. Our very own Anjali Waikar, NUSO class of 2005. 1 year ahead of you, Renee? Okay. Attorney Waikar oversees legal operations for the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, an international nonprofit organization working to protect the public health and environment. Previously, she was an attorney with NRDC's Environmental Justice Team, working to advance health justice on behalf of vulnerable communities. She was also one of the original members of the litigation team that sued under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act to ensure Flint, Michigan residents have safe drinking water. Attorney Waikar has dedicated her legal career to advancing the rights of the underserved. She worked at the ACLU of Massachusetts, focusing on immigrants' rights and post-9/11 racial and ethnic profiling, and later at Crocodus and Bluestein in Boston, where she represented and advised primarily nonprofit organizations regarding litigation, employment, healthcare, privacy and data security, education law, and other civil matters. We had a discussion earlier, and she said one thing that she stayed away from was real estate law. It was a smart move. Always stay away from real estate law. No, just kidding. It's a great field. Before law school, Anjali worked as a South Brooklyn Legal Services case handler, advocating for public benefits for low-income HIV-infected individuals. Currently, Attorney Waikar is a Cook County Human Rights Commissioner. Along with today's community lecture, we hope you'll also join Attorney Waikar and her colleagues for a roundtable discussion entitled Environmental Justice, Case Studies on Policy, Advocacy, and Litigation Trends. This Wednesday, September 21 at 12:45 p.m. right here in Doxer 240. And now I will turn it over to our Daynard Distinguished Fellow, Anjali Waikar, for her talk entitled On the Public Interest Path, Changing Lanes Along the Way.
Thank you so much, Dean Hackney. It is such a pleasure to meet all of you. Honestly, it was a surreal experience walking here today through the law school because I realized it was actually 20 years ago, almost to the day, that I walked through the doors of Northeastern as a first year. So I understand a lot of you are first year students here today, and congratulations on beginning your legal career. I'm really excited to be here, and I hope also that I get to meet as many of you as possible over the next few days while I'll be on campus. So before I get started, I do want to say a few short thank yous to the Northeastern community. First of all, thank you to Dick Daynard and Carol for making this opportunity available. Dean Hackney, Lucy Williams, and Shannon Al-Wakil, along with the entire Center for Public Interest, Advocacy, and Collaboration. Thank you also, especially to the students who helped select me for this talk. I'm really thrilled to be here. And finally, a really sincere thank you to Professor Martha Davis, who I see hiding in the back. She, I think, emerged from sabbatical to be here, and she really has been a true influence for me in my career, and I just want to say thank you to her, especially in the early stages of my career. So, on a more personal note, I also have to thank a few people. My mom, who's in the corner, who traveled with me from Chicago, as well as my dear sister-in-law, Monica Burrell. Monica served until early last year as the Commissioner of Public Health for the state of Massachusetts, and was until recently a special advisor to Boston's Mayor Wu, addressing the housing encampment issues on Massachusetts Avenue and Melnia Cass, just right around the corner. And given Dick Daynard's significant contributions to public health, I'm glad that Commissioner Burrell could be here. And I have a final thank you. And this I was really thinking about a lot as I was preparing for my talk. This might be a little strange, but I want to thank in particular the many South Asian women activists and social justice lawyers who have walked through the door here at Northeastern. Many progressive South Asian women, including people like Urvashi Vaid, who was a trailblazer in the NUSL LGBTQI space, has really had an enduring legacy at Northeastern. And I know that Northeastern is going to be celebrating her soon, and I'm so happy to see that. Some of these women, I will say, I know personally. Some I've never met. Some I may be friends with on Facebook, but I secretly stalk from time to time because I think they're really cool. This always happens. It doesn't matter how old you are. But because of these women, I saw a place for myself in the public interest lawyering world where I didn't grow up or have role models in this space. And Northeastern gave me that in really unexpected ways. So thank you to Northeastern. All right. So I was thinking about what to talk with you about today, and I realized that I can really go in a lot of directions. And I know that you were particularly interested in hearing about careers in the in the environmental space. But I have to say, I have changed lanes so many times, and sometimes I feel like still I'm trying to figure out what it is that I want to do when I grow up. Although somebody actually asked if I was a student's mother today, so that made me feel really bad. The reality is, at this stage in my career, I am not a subject matter expert. I am not a law professor. I am not an academic. But in my legal career, I have worn many, many hats. I have worn many hats on behalf of communities and working in and on behalf of nonprofits. As an advocate, a lawyer, supporting organizers, relationship builder, de facto general counsel, board member, manager, and operations director. And I've done so in a range of sectors, whether it's the private, for-profit, or nonprofit sectors, all with an eye for doing good for others. Now, no one anymore is just a lawyer, am I right? Like, have you guys looked on LinkedIn and see the bios and people are like, lawyer, storyteller, human rights, feminist, mother, you know, it kind of stresses me out, and I imagine is probably what online dating is for all of you these days. So when I got Dean Hackney's email inviting me to this event, and this is really a true story, so apologies, but I was very embarrassed. And the reason I was embarrassed is because, quite honestly, I thought the email was sent to the wrong Anjali. Now, you may not believe me, but Anjali is actually a very common name in South Asia. There's many, it's like Jenny, basically. And there's actually an Anjali at NRDC where I work, and she heads the India department. So I get her emails all the time. So when I got the email, I thought, wow, that's really sad because I went to Northeastern and I'm not being invited. He sent it to the wrong person. So I say this because imposter syndrome is real and alive, and I don't think it ever goes away. And if it does, I think probably there's something wrong. All right, so I'm really actually thrilled to talk to you all because I know that you are all budding public interest lawyers who have so much going for you ahead. My talk today, the goal is to unpack and demystify the community lawyering model. Am I talking too loudly? Okay. Thank you. I want to unpack and demystify the community lawyering model. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to share a few case studies of my own work where I've been involved in over the last 15 years. I want to give a bird's eye view and to pull back the curtain of what it means to work at different types of traditional public interest organizations. That includes legal services, ACLU, private law firm, as well as NRDC. Racial justice in particular has always been an issue that has cut through all of my work. Now, to the extent that I've engaged in community lawyering, it has looked different and had its own advantages and challenges depending on where I've worked. And I think it's important as you embark your careers to think about the organizations that you're working for, how they operate, and in terms of what it will inform what we can and will achieve for our clients. I also believe that doing good isn't just possible in the nonprofit sector. And in fact, community lawyering isn't the only way to do good. I believe that all of us have an obligation to think about equity and justice in our work, regardless of whether we're working in government, for profit, as prosecutors, or in corporate law firms. Now, you may not agree with everything I'm going to say today, but these are my experiences, and I hope that you can pick up whatever resonates for you and helps you in your own journeys. So, I want to just take a moment and talk about context. We can't talk about public interest lawyering without sort of setting the framework and talking about all that's going on, right? Times are tough. We all know that. We are just emerging from a global pandemic. Many of us are still grappling with social anxiety and struggling with the social awkwardness of meeting people in person in real time for the first time. I know I'm feeling overwhelmed, are you? Reproductive rights have been eviscerated. Immigrants and children are being politicized. The world is at once burning and flooding. The effects of climate change are inescapable. We're not sure if that glass of water that you got from the tap is safe to drink. So instead, we buy bottled water, hoping but not realizing that the water in the bottle is actually subject to less regulatory strict standards than the tap itself. That $1.50 we paid for that bottle is now worth more like $2 because of inflation. Oh, and the bottle itself, yeah, it's never leaving the universe. People around the world are hungrier than ever. Food insecurity is at an all-time high. The average death rate in America and in other parts of the world are falling. Schools are not safe, as many of you, I'm sure, felt last week. And neither are the streets or the homes for Black men and women. And unequivocally, Black and brown communities across the country in rural and urban areas are statistically facing the brunt of all of this and so much more. And we have witnessed an absolute national awakening to race as we watch the horrific death of George Floyd and embrace the Black Lives Matter movement. And some stared aghast at those who are unwilling to say it. And the list goes on and on and on. It feels to me, as my time having moved back to my hometown in Chicago, having moved back to Chicago in 2015, that's where I grew up, that the pace of change and the rapid dismantling of rights over the last several years have been mind-blowing, and dare I say, unprecedented. It feels like we can hardly keep up. So let me say this. As you embark on your legal careers, there are many, many paths to follow. I don't know how to save the world. You know how sometimes you have like a million things to do and you just can't get anything done, mostly because you just are so overwhelmed on how to get started, right? Well, sometimes I feel like that, and I think a lot of people out there do too. And as our country grapples with race in a way that we've never been seen before, we are getting more polarized, and there is an expectation placed upon all of us to directly address, grapple, and opine publicly on our views. Big institutions like NRDC and other green groups are grappling with the legacy of white dominance, just as individual employers like myself are having to be accountable, ensuring that we're doing enough around DEI issues in the workplace. It's not enough to be doing community-based work, but our organizations have an obligation to the people that work there in terms of policies and practices and procedures. You all are demanding a lot, and we all share in this responsibility and in this work. Every single one of us has an obligation, no matter what hat we are wearing. And as somebody who has worked traditionally in white-dominated places of employment my entire life, I will say this. I think what is happening is amazing, and I think it is hard work. All right, a little bit depressing so far. Sorry, that's the reality. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself before I get started, so I want you to know who I am. I was born and raised on the far south side of Chicago, exactly 45 years ago to the day yesterday. Yes. I was born in a town called Harvey, Illinois, a predominantly black neighborhood 25 miles south of Chicago, and that has among the highest unemployment rates in the entire state of Illinois, facing a mass exodus from severe disinvestments over the last several years. And when I was born to my Indian parents, first person to be born in the United States. Now, although my parents came here lawfully, my parents came here, frankly, because they were lucky. They had the opportunity to start lives in this country due to the laws that were created by privileged white men in Washington, D.C. that allowed for certain people with certain skilled professional degrees to come and live here. And I was born in Harvey because my dad was a doctor on staff at the hospital there. Now, as a child, race and class were very important to me, front and center. I grew up in an all-white neighborhood in the suburbs of Chicago, and I begged my parents to send me to private school on the far south side of Chicago so that I could be closer to other people of color and other kids of immigrants like myself. After school, they finally succumbed, and I went to this school, and I loved my school. And after school every day, I would go to my dad's medical practice, a two-room office very close to my school, and I would hang out in the waiting room with his patients who were predominantly black and all on welfare or public aid. Looking back, those experiences instilled in me a very strong sense of identity, self-awareness, and social consciousness, and appreciation for how our lived experiences are shaped by, among other things, factors like race, class, and discrimination. Looking back, I also realize that because of what I look like, how I sound, and how I grew up with racial privilege of being able to pass and be accepted in different communities, changing lanes and spaces has come somewhat naturally to me. My mom's advice to my brother was, be an expert, and everyone will always come to you forever. So I was the second born, and I never got so much advice, but I always listened to what the advice my brother was getting, and then I would do just the opposite. So I didn't become a doctor, and I didn't become a specialist. Or every time I did become a specialist, I changed lanes. Now, query whether my ex-boyfriends were right when they claimed that I have a fear of commitment. All right, so as I said, I'm going to dig into a few cases of things that I've worked on to shed light on community lawyering. That includes work in Flint, which I know some of you are particularly interested about. So to make sure that we're all on the same page, I think it's helpful to provide some common framework about what we're talking about, though I suspect many of you will already be pretty familiar. Lawyers, in general, it's a traditional model, right? We all know that outside the community lawyering context. It is adversarial in nature. Oftentimes, though not always, the lawyers are in positions of power. The more money the lawyer charges, the more apparently capable they may be. And in short, the traditional adversarial system, as we know it, is plagued with inherent unequal and unfair power dynamics. Community lawyering, on the other hand, works alongside community groups to elevate, center, and empower the voices of those communities. And there are many tools beyond just litigation in the community lawyer's toolkit. We'll talk about some of them as the talk goes on. And I know you will cover a lot of this during your time at Northeastern, as I had, and I'll share some of those tactics. Community lawyering, depending on where you work, can be challenging, it can be limiting, and it can be rewarding. Now, some of this stuff you may already know, and I hope that my experience does provide some insight, and I'm excited to answer your questions at the end of this talk. And before I forget, I do also want to put a plug again for Wednesday's talk on environmental justice. Even if you're not specifically interested in environmental law or environmental justice in particular, I strongly believe that learning from community lawyering models, especially in other lanes, is incredibly important to the work you're doing, as I said before, no matter what kind of law you wind up practicing. All right, so let me begin. good water. I like to think that I started my legal career at legal services, even though I worked at legal services before I went to law school. After graduating college, I moved to New York City to work at South Brooklyn Legal Services and worked in the HIV unit. Now, I started working in legal services, this was the late 1990s, when the HIV and AIDS crisis was still high, though not at its peak compared to the 1980s. And in the mid-1990s, the introduction of new drug therapies were helping to extend people's lives. There was a significant drop in AIDS-related deaths, and areas like New York provided enhanced benefits relating to housing, food stamps, and other public benefits vouchers. The legal services model is one type of traditional public interest lawyering that I'm sure many of you have already experienced or learned about in your law school. Legal services are funded by government. These are called LSC funds or legal service organization funds. And while this money gives lawyers the ability to provide low-cost services or free services to their clients, it does come at a cost because the lawyers are therefore restricted from being able to do things like suing the government with class action lawsuits. So in our unit, made up mostly of lawyers and paralegals like myself, we were generalists. I love being a generalist, right? Our unit was called the Comprehensive Rights Unit. So we helped our clients in all areas of public benefits: housing, food stamps, social security, childcare, etc. And because the venues were administrative courts, I, as a non-lawyer, was able to represent my clients in these venues, many of these venues, not all. Sometimes I had to meet my clients in their homes because they were too sick to get to the office. And I pored over hundreds of pages of medical records regularly to find evidence that my clients' medical issues were serious enough to warrant enhanced protections under the city, state, and federal government. I argued in front of administrative law judges that my clients were entitled to public benefits that they were seeking or had recently been cut off from. I loved my job. I loved my clients, and it was hard. But I loved the ability to provide a direct service and to conduct know your rights trainings to community groups, providing services to people living with HIV and AIDS. The thing is, during my brief time in legal services, a little over 2 years, I won my cases virtually every single time. So you would think that's a good thing, right? But it wasn't. I could see how broken the system was. The issues that my clients were facing often were issues that could have and should have been resolved without the help of an advocate. Most of my clients were Black and Hispanic. Virtually all the lawyers in my unit were white, as were many of the administrative law judges. Why was I winning all my cases? Was it because I was particularly good at my job? I mean, I'd like to think so, but no. It's because my clients' cases should not have been in the adversarial system in the first place. The problems they were facing were so complicated that a lawyer or trained paralegal should not have been needed. Often those issues were more systemic in nature. So after working for 2 years, a little 2.5 years at legal services, really that work deeply impacted me. I knew I wanted to go to law school, although I felt on a very personal level very satisfied with the work that I was doing with my clients. I knew enough to know that I wasn't serving my clients and the community as effectively as I could. That is, I felt like I was just one more cog in the system, and my clients had to get through in order to see change. And at that stage in my career, being happy at work wasn't enough. I wanted to fix the system. In other words, I felt like my work as an advocate was disempowering my clients, and my role in the system was not doing anything to fix the systemic issues. I often wondered if my salary, for example, would have been better off given to the government to pay for more government funding to effectively provide the support to the people that deserved it. I also knew that if I ever returned to legal services to advocate for poor, disenfranchised communities to fight the systemic challenges that they were facing, whether it was through access to healthcare, housing rights, healthy food, cleaner air, freedom from violence, it was going to be through systemic change. So, with that context, I attended Northeastern, and I set out to be a lawyer. I got the opportunity to take welfare law class with Lucy Williams and understand from an academic perspective the context for that work, read people like Luke Cole's social theories on community lawyering, and took immigration law from Martha Davis. And after graduating, I was fortunate to get a job working at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Honestly, I think in some ways, Northeastern really normalized community lawyering in my mind. And I really am grateful for that experience because I don't think that you're going to get it necessarily everywhere. I didn't think about practicing any other form of law. I didn't second guess that I would ever not be working to advance the rights of communities. At the time, the Massachusetts affiliate, which largely focuses on statewide issues, which is much smaller and hadn't hired a new lawyer in many, many years, I was seeking to explore whether impact litigation could fix the systemic problems. I say this without ever really knowing what impact litigation looked like or whether I would even enjoy doing it. But it sounded like the right step. So unlike legal services, ACLU and other membership organizations like NRDC, where I work now, do not get federal funds and therefore can bring suit in federal court, which allows them quite a bit of freedom in terms of the cases that they bring. And because the funds from donors and foundations, they're not restricted, they can be pretty creative. However, it is important as you venture out into the world of public interest lawyering to realize that the issues that do get ultimately funded are determined by who else other than those with money. So for example, I received an Equal Justice Works Fellowship. For those of you who are not familiar with it, I encourage you to look into it. It's a fellowship that provides recent law grads who are interested in working with a host partner and a host organization to apply for 2 years. EJW will then interview you with your host organization, and an outside firm or corporation will fund the project. I just want to unpack this for a second. That meant that my salary was funded in part by the Mass Affiliate, which was responsible to its donors and funders, by the Equal Justice Works Fellowship, that was also responsible to its donors, the private law firm, which was spending money out of its profits that it was making probably bank on, and the strategic, and all of these three players had a strategic role in the work that I was doing. And my law school loans were covered by the foundation. So this trifecta of funding is a gift. It was a gift for me. But it also shows very clearly how the work can be guided by these really big cooks in the kitchen, for better or worse. And most importantly, I think it shows how some groups have historically had the most amount of funding available, including groups like ACLU, and can sometimes take over larger pieces of available resources to those other groups who may not otherwise have access or less resources to bear, even in terms of fundraising capacity. So this trifecta group also decides whether the work continues after the fellowship is over. In any case, I think it's important, again, money matters, and as journalists say, follow the money. This is why I raised the point. So my project was to address post 9/11 racial profiling and Islamophobia in Massachusetts that included the increasing targeting of Arabs and Muslims in places of worship who were asked to be served as informants. In terms of what it looked like, I worked closely with community groups across the state, including with lawyers who worked in different areas like immigration law, habeas, and criminal proceedings. And as I started to work closely with the community groups, we started to realize a new trend that was emerging. At the time, the governor of Massachusetts was a guy named Mitt Romney. You guys know him? He would later run for president for a different state. The hot button issue at the time was something known as a 287G. And this was, at the time, among the very first of these agreements in the country, though now I understand is much more widespread. So for those of you who have not interacted with this program, the 287G refers to a program that the federal government allows entities to engage in a memorandum of agreement. Typically, immigration laws are enforced by federal agents, and in such circumstances where a local agency or entity will enter into agreement with the federal government, it will essentially deputize them to practice federal immigration laws. While federal immigration laws are typically enforced by the federal government, these local entities might include things like a specific jail, a specific police department, a specific courthouse, or probation officer to enforce the laws. What Governor Mitt Romney did at the time, though, just to be very clear, he entered into a 287G specifically with the Mass State Police. But you can imagine that an immigrant living in the community may not necessarily understand or realize that it's just limited to the state police. And the state police and other police departments across the state were confused about their responsibilities around the 287G. So local police departments that were not the state police thought that they were empowered and entitled to be able to ask people, where are you from? Show me your papers during routine traffic stops. Other entities also got involved. That includes other law enforcement agencies courthouses, the registry of motor vehicles, everyone was asking about, it seemed, was asking about immigration status. And it was somewhat chaotic. So regardless of what the law actually authorizes, whether legal or not, I should say, there was a lot of fear in the community and all across the state. So it was obvious there was a lot of work to do. And one of the roles that I was helping to play for the ACLU at the time was to serve as a central repository for this issue across the state, while coordinating and collaborating closely with other statewide and local immigrants' rights groups. And this made sense given the role that ACO played, which is a statewide organization. Now, we talk a lot about using non-litigation tactics in community law. As part of our advocacy strategy, the biggest piece of it was documentation, because it was so confusing about what was happening. How do you find out about the problem, especially when there's an incredible amount of distrust and fear in the community? Also, I didn't live in the communities, we didn't live in the communities, and so how do you get into those places? We also recognized as outsiders that there would be a difficulty in establishing trust. So what we did was we set up call-in numbers and lines to do intakes. We set up referral systems. We did know your rights trainings with different community groups. We drafted fact sheets. We translated them into different languages. And we trained other advocates who were receiving the calls from the communities to know what kind of questions to ask, because these were very fact-specific types of issues. What was the nature of the interaction with the police? Which type of police was it? Was he plainclothes or not? Where in the state was it? What were the questions that were asked? And what did they say the basis of the stop was? And on and on and on. The documentation revealed, one, there was a lot of confusion, not only in the immigrant community, but within the police departments themselves. And even within the police departments themselves, they didn't know what their responsibilities were. Ultimately, armed with all of this research and a lot of facts about what was happening in the state, we brought this information to the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security, which operates the state police department. Our advocacy resulted, along with all the other community groups, a change to the Mass State Police manual that would allow the state police to be able to understand their responsibilities under the 287G order. We also got some specific police departments throughout the state that were not subject to 287G to agree publicly that they were not enforcing federal immigration laws. It helped to reduce some level of fear in the community, and it also clarified the protocol for the state police. In retrospect, I think one of the reasons why this advocacy was a success in some ways is because of the nature of working together. ACLU worked closely with other immigrants' rights groups and other lawyers, and everyone had a role to play in all of this. One area that was particularly challenging, though, was litigation. As you know, litigation is a strategy to achieve social change, but it's not always the only strategy. We did ultimately sue the Registry of Motor Vehicles for the work they were doing, and we tried to engage in some creative lawyering. And this is where I think some of the personal challenges came up for me. It became clear to me that the individuals who were being picked up, especially in Western Massachusetts, were being picked up by local police for minor traffic violations, essentially arrested for that bogus traffic violation, and then transferred to ICE custody, and then swept up in the deportation proceedings and deported before anyone could ever figure out what happened. In order to get at that, I started looking around the country and saw that a new litigation strategy was being employed. Now, I understand these are issues that are happening very often now, and I guess part of what I'm trying to provide is a little bit of context that this was the first time that this was kind of happening. So these issues may last for years. The things that you're going to start seeing after you graduate law school may last for decades, right? You may think that you're helping to move the needle, and hopefully you are, but change is long, and the fight is longer. So we essentially brought a couple of cases in federal immigration court. Now, this is an area that ACLU the affiliate had not practiced in. The national office was starting to do them. And there was some discussion about whether, in fact, immigrants' rights is considered or should be considered a racial justice issue. And I say that because I think this is also a theme around where we are going as a country in our movements. Environmental law also, I think, there is significant discussions around green groups, including organizations like NRDC, about whether we should be staying in our lane or whether we should be engaging in this work. So in short, I just really briefly brought these cases in immigration court. I had to actually seek guidance from another outside lawyer, the legal director of the ACLU of Connecticut, who helped me bring these suppression cases, essentially using criminal arguments, which is, I don't know how many of you are in criminal law yet and learned about the fruits of the poisonous tree, but essentially bringing constitutional claims to say that the basis for the stop was unlawful and therefore the immigration judge should throw out the case because the arrest itself was illegal and therefore the evidence that's being used against them should be thrown out. So these cases actually lasted 9 years. Ultimately, when I went to private practice, I wound up transferring them over to another clinic to help with them. And again, the fights are long. But I'm pleased to say that both of my clients actually are still here in Massachusetts and doing very well. So I guess I just highlighted a couple of the challenges here. Working closely with the immigrants' rights community is wonderful if it's done properly. The challenge, though, was that it was not necessarily a shared perspective in terms of whether non-litigation advocacy should be used in immigration court. And the funding issue was it allowed me to do the work, but it also ended, right? And so I think this is an important piece to remember. All right, so you know my talk. It's entitled Changing Lanes, and so I changed lanes again. Okay. So because I tend to get really into the thing, and then things change, and I decide to move on. And at this point in my career, I really did enjoy community work, but I felt like at this point I wasn't really getting the litigation tools that I felt was really important for me. While I took a chance on those suppression cases, and I was able to work in administrative proceedings where I really wanted to do depositions, I wanted to draft interrogatories, I wanted to be able to sue when I threatened to sue. At least that's how I felt. So I went to a private law firm after I left ACLU, and I shared this story in part because I think it's really important to remember that community lawyering and doing good and infusing equity and justice in our work is not limited to nonprofit work. I happened to work for a law firm that I think I felt really good about. It was the firm is still around. A large percentage of our clients were were nonprofits. As it so happened, so I started as a litigator for the first couple of years, and then I started developing a lot of relationships with many of the partners who had their own practice areas. Everybody was siloed, right? And this is me, not a silo person at all. So I worked with pretty much many of the partners, and one of the partners in particular had a charter school practice. She represented a very large percentage of charter schools in Massachusetts. And so in this situation, I started doing a lot of the transactional work on the charter schools. But as it happens, when you develop relationships with people, you guys are all going to start getting a lot of phone calls after you graduate, like, hey, I have this legal question, can you help me? And you're like, oh, I don't practice securities laws or whatever. You'll be representing your clients in eviction proceedings, I'm sure. So I say this because our clients then would call us up and say, well, we have a lot of school expulsion cases or school disciplinary matters, and these are getting kind of complicated. And the reason they were getting complicated is because, for context here, public schools are subject to state laws, Department of Education, and federal, of course, and regulatory regulations. Charter schools have their own set of laws that are sort of exceptions or in addition to the general law. And then with students who are on IEPs, individual education plans, who may be entitled to rights under disability laws that are enhanced protections, that's an exception to an exception to an exception. And so these were kind of complicated questions, right? I don't know that these schools would have normally been calling a lawyer who charges hourly to help with this, run-of-the-mill school disciplinary matter, but these were a little bit complicated. So my client, a charter school, called and said, hey, I have a second grader, brought a knife to school, and he's on an IEP, he's disabled, we would like to expel him. Now, I just want to remind all of you in the room that you don't lose your personhood when you become a lawyer, right? You are still who you are. You still have beliefs that you have. And it is important to not let those leave the room when you leave or when you come to the door. So I said to my client, in full transparency, I thought my client was making a wrong choice. In private practice, it's not advocacy, right? It's a different form of modeling of lawyering. My job in private practice is to say to my client who calls me with a problem, this is what the law says that you absolutely have to do. This is what the law says that you absolutely cannot do. And in between is some sort of, let's call it business judgment decision, right? As a policy matter, you, client, get to do whatever you want. That part of it, I didn't really like the answer to that my client was going to say. I didn't think that the student should get expelled based on the limited facts that I had. And the issue for me was, in particular, and I said this to the client, that every time you've come to me with a school disciplinary matter, the student is Black or Hispanic, Latino. I am not seeing all the other school disciplinary matters that you're dealing with. But from my perspective, 100% of them are kids of color. And depending on what the other disciplinary matters are that you're dealing with, it is very possible for the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights to come in and pose questions, right? So I was talking to my client from a liability perspective. Let's try to minimize your liability here. And, let me just say, my clients were extremely dedicated to the schools, the students. I mean, they're really well-intentioned, I was going to say well-intentioned white people, but that's not what I mean. But they're educators that truly believed in the work that they were doing. And so I don't want to suggest, and I certainly did not mean to suggest, that my client was being racist. But I'm not sure I articulated that quite as effectively as I should have, because the client then went to talk to the partner. The partner came to me and said, the client wasn't really happy with the advice that you were giving, and, essentially, let's talk about it. And ultimately, the partner did, in fact, agree with my perspective, agreed that it was a legitimate question to raise. Looking back, I was a much, much younger lawyer and less experienced, and I can imagine these were issues that I felt strongly about, but probably didn't articulate in a way that I could have done in a more effective way. And I think looking back, I think about that a lot. Ultimately, I'm actually, to be honest, I'm not sure what the client decided to do, because they didn't call me back about the issue. For what it's worth. Point being, you can do good work in private practice. You can do good work as a prosecutor. You can do good work in government. And in fact, you should be. We should all be thinking about these issues and helping to push the conversation with our clients, even if our clients aren't asking us the question. All right. I'm going to move on, because I know that I'm chatting for a while here. But 7 years in private practice, and I was ready to change lanes again. And this time, my motivating factor was that I really wanted to get back into public interest work. I loved representing my clients, I loved my colleagues, and I loved the work, and it actually kept me satiated for a really long time. But I felt very lonely in private practice. I felt like I wasn't part of a movement anymore. And so I wanted to get back into the public interest world, and I wanted to move back to my hometown of Chicago. And so I decided to join the NRDC and serve as an environmental justice lawyer in the Chicago office. Now, we spend about 80, so when we think about environmental work, we think about climate, we think about outdoor air quality issues. My issue was that I was particularly interested in going back to my poverty law roots, and I wanted to work on indoor environmental quality issues, looking at things like lead paint, looking at mold in housing that causes and exacerbates asthma, looking at our lived experiences. And in fact, pre-pandemic, I think by some estimates, we lived something like 80 to 90% of our lives indoors. So you can imagine what's happening now. So I joined NRDC with the idea that this is what I was going to be working on, specifically in the Midwest. And I'll tell you at the outset, I really wasn't very familiar with NRDC's work before I applied. I hadn't taken environmental law classes. I'm sorry, Breckenridge. But I'm here. And I really knew a little bit about environmental justice, but I didn't realize how little I had really known. I knew about it in theory. I didn't appreciate or understand really how complicated that dynamic would be, particularly working at a large organization like NRDC. So as a threshold matter, I'm also going to say I admit I was out of my depths. The organization itself was filled with true experts in their field who had been working at the organization for 30 to 40 years, real substantive expertise in very complicated issues involving the environment. And I was intimidated. But looking back, I think my experiences working in and on behalf of communities prior to my career at NRDC, it really helped leverage my skills. And I think that is why, even if there isn't at this time an environmental professor at Northeastern, I think it is incumbent upon you to think about other areas of the law to help enhance and sort of provide further context for the work that you may ultimately be doing if you decide to go into the environmental route. So I was working on environmental justice issues, and I think it's important to set the framework. What is EJ? Again, I want to put a plug. Please come on Wednesday to our talk, because I think it'll be a lot more deep dive on Flint and on environmental justice more broadly. But in short, people call this issue different things, right? Whether it's environmental justice, environmental racism. But the point is this, that what we are talking about is not how do we protect the environment. It is how do we protect people from the adverse impacts of the environment. And environmental justice is based on this basic premise that low-income communities and communities of color are more likely to shoulder the pollution's heaviest burdens and often do not have the fair share of basic environmental amenities like open access to green space, healthy foods, transportation. It also includes indoor issues, like I mentioned, like drinking water, mold, and housing, and other adverse housing conditions. Some may know Bruce Bullard, considered the father of the environmental justice movement. And in recent years, he's actually gotten a ton of press coverage. And I think environmental justice issues just become so hot topic in the last 5 years. He's considered the father of the environmental justice movement. And as a social scientist, he's actually done a lot of studies. And one of the things that he has said is that climate change in particular overlays the issue of who has contributed the most and who is bearing the brunt of those issues. And it is statistically a fact that low-income communities will be next to a polluting, emitting refinery that is more likely to cause health impacts on that community. Who is carrying the burden around sea level rise and droughts, widening the income inequality? And he suggests, as many EJ advocates who have been doing this work for decades, that we infuse an equity framework into everything that we're working on, including climate change. In other words, we cannot talk about climate change if we are not talking about climate equity and climate justice. So it's important to understand that organizations like NRDC are still figuring this out themselves. The broader context is that organizations like NRDC are extremely well-funded and largely white historically. When I joined NRDC in 2015, we had 300 people, and now we are closer to 1,000, which is pretty remarkable. And when I joined NRDC in 2015, it was a debate. Do we stay in our lane as environmental advocates, saving the whales, the dolphins, the public lands, or do we start entering into racial justice and racial equity issues? And many people did feel, and perhaps still do feel, that the organization should stay in its lane. So I'm going to give you just a really brief overview about NRDC, because I feel like I can't come here today and talk without talking about environmental law. For those of you who are familiar, and I'll say I didn't even know NRDC in law school except for Fed courts, Chevron versus NRDC, raise your hand. Okay, professor? No, you're not a professor, okay. And Chevron versus NRDC was an important, you'll learn about it, is an important administrative law class, case, from the Supreme Court regarding agency deference. But so NRDC is like I said, it's an environmental organization. We have offices all over the country. We work in India and China. Right now we have up to 1,000 people. And we work to protect the environment and the public health. And I'm based in our Chicago office. We have offices all over the country. But it's not just lawyers. We have scientists, we have policymakers, advocates, people doing legislative work, as well as a huge communications team. And all of these people play a role together in ensuring that science prevails and the rule of law governs. We have lawyers who work to ensure that the laws as they exist are enforced and hold officials and private actors accountable. Now, I work for the litigation team, and you won't believe it, but our litigation team has 30 lawyers. That's a very small team. And our team basically supports the other 3 programmatic areas. And those 3 programmatic areas include climate, healthy people, which is, toxins, drinking water, anything that sort of affects people, and then, of course, nature. And so our team of lawyers, yet again, as I bring up this theme, are generalists, right? So no one on our litigation team specializes in one particular area of law. And so anything that the programs kind of bring up, the litigators will come in and litigate that particular issue. NRDC also works, just to give the breadth of scope of the organization, at every single level of government, depending on the place in the country. Federally, obviously, we do a lot of work at the federal side. We work in specific cities, we work in specific states, and we work in some local communities like the EJ team. And when I joined NRDC, do you know how big the EJ team was? Just throw out a guess. I'm just curious if anybody. How many people were on the EJ team in 2015 at NRDC? Oh, pretty close, yeah, like about 7, yeah. And now, you can imagine, like, with an organization that big, and, how can you really be committed to equity and justice, right? And so a lot of the work that we were doing was a lot of internal facing work, which is like teaching and educating our colleagues about how to engage in community lawyering. Now, with an organization this big, we actually have established, and the organization is spending a lot of money in terms of building out equity for the organization. And it is a work in progress, and it is a lot of work. We have 45 minutes. I have a lot to say about Flint, and it's sort of a hard thing to talk about, but I will just briefly cover Flint here. And then again, I really encourage you to please come to the panel on Wednesday. When I joined NRDC, like I said, they actually said it was a very entrepreneurial spirit. So I was like, okay, great. I'm going to work on indoor qualities. This is what I want to do at NRDC. I'm going to go do it. Like nobody's going to bother me. That's not how EJ works, right? EJ works around what does the community want and what does the community think is most important and what do they need your help in. So within the first few months of joining NRDC in the Chicago office, as it happens, we were invited in by ACLU of Michigan and other community groups asking for us to look at the drinking water quality issues that was taking place in Flint at the time. This is 2015, well before Flint became national news, well before anyone had it on their radar or national or international news. Flint's population, as many of you know, was 100,000 people, 40% of them living below poverty line, and sadly, majority of those individuals were African American, Black, and a significant immigrant population. When they contacted us, I just want to be very clear, the community was mad. The community was loud, and they were fighting for their justice. And we were outsiders. I told you in 2015, I had never really even heard of NRDC. The community in Flint had not heard of NRDC. And that is a challenge when doing community work. And it's a challenge as an employee of an organization doing community work when the place that you work, no one's even ever heard of, right? I think it's different if you're working at a place like ACLU, people kind of know it, it's sort of part of the nomenclature. I think that wasn't always the case with NRDC. So part of our responsibility was to ensure that we were creating trust in the community, and that required regular FaceTime. We don't have an office in Flint, right? So you can imagine how challenging that is. It is clear to me that, but for the advocacy and the organizing efforts of the community, that really, and the religious communities and the mothers, that Flint would not have become the case that it was, but for their work. And at some point, it seemed like nobody was listening, but as different orgs start coming in and sort of amplifying the work, it started to gain traction. So NRDC investigated while, trying to ensure that we were not over-promising to the community about what we were able to do, and also not over-promising that we were going to stay in the community for the long haul. I mean, personally, I struggled with this, right? If I'm talking to, I visited Flint about a dozen times over the first couple of years of my time at NRDC, and it was a difficult thing for me to say with a straight face that, yes, NRDC is committed for the long haul, because I could not say that. And I wasn't going to put my face out there and say that. So I think these are the kinds of things that you grapple with, especially working for a large organization as big as NRDC is when you're working at a local level. And I hope things will kind of change over time, but I think that was definitely true for me in terms of beginning to build the trust and gain our our clients and our communities sort of buy-in with our work. So there's also a lot of benefits, and I'll end with that. Benefits to working in a place like NRDC. These cases are expensive to bring. Requires a lot of face time, a lot of travel, a lot of in-house expert, like getting testing on the drinking water, experts on the engineering, our communications team. I mean, the amount of sort of overall expenditure was enormous, and ultimately it was all worth it in the sense that the case ultimately resolved for a $100 million settlement agreement, due in no part to myself, but to our amazing litigators who, the funding is not in money damages, but it's to be allocated specifically for the replacement of the lead service lines in the community. And then also the scientists and engineers in our office and at NRDC who basically were able to do GIS mapping to determine where all the lead service lines were throughout the city. So I will just say in conclusion that careers are long, hopefully, and some of you may want to practice and some of you may not. But I think it is critically important to take what you learned at Northeastern in terms of equity and justice and think about how it applies to everything that you do, because I think that's where the world is heading, and I think that that's where we should be heading. Engaging in issues like community lawyering, I think, will help us all be better lawyers, regardless of where we end up working. Prosecutors, as you know, exercise a lot of prosecutorial discretion, deciding whether a client gets the death penalty or life without parole. And changing lanes and adjusting to the world is something that I think we are all going to have to do. Keep yourself present and look to your neighbors next to you, because you all may be doing amazing things. And use your community as a resource and stay in touch. I'm probably still figuring out my career. That's just who I am. I like to evaluate and reevaluate all the time, like every year, every month, every couple of 6 months. So I'm always like, what should I do next? So don't listen to me is what I'm saying. But also do listen to me, but don't just listen to me. Talk to other people. Talk to other lawyers, other practitioners, your professors, other colleagues. In this time of Zoom, we have this beautiful advantage of being able to just, dial someone up and see them on screen, so you don't have to go and visit them. But do try to do the coffee stuff. I think it's important. And as these days have shown, we're human and we gain a lot of connections. We get a lot of traction from connecting with each other. And if we don't, and if we keep talking to ourselves in our own silos, well, you see what happened with Trump's election, right? We didn't see that coming necessarily. Not all of us did. So anyway, I want to thank you all, and I wish you all the best of luck in your adventures here at Northeastern. Thank you. All right. So I guess we have some questions, yeah?
Yeah, we
Okay.
have a bit of time if folks would like to ask Anjali some questions. I volunteered to moderate because we expect there's going to be a lot of interest. So if you just put up your hands, if you'd like to.
It's perfectly fine if you don't have questions.
I was wondering, in terms of, you said you weren't really familiar with environmental justice things before you got into NRDC. How did that education happen at NRDC, and how long did it take for you to feel comfortable to be, I know you're not an expert or specialist in it, but comfortable to announce that you were participating in that group?
Yeah, when could I do talks on EJ, basically, incredibly? I will say, I think something that I've heard from many environmentalists or people who are wanting to get involved in environmental work is that they feel that there's a little bit of a barrier, they don't feel like they are able to kind of connect, or they feel dumb asking questions, and it's because it's so technical and so complicated. I think with environmental justice, honestly, I feel like in any community lawyering we have to bring people in, and it has to be a safe space to be able to understand the issues. Because if you don't understand the issues, you're not going to want to learn it, and you're not going to get engaged, and you're not going to do anything about it, right? So I would say, to answer your question specifically, my colleagues were amazing. I just wound up like reading everything that everybody said I should read, and I think honestly, as I was grappling with questions from my colleagues who were not on the EJ team, it helped me sort of be in a position almost of like having to answer the questions appropriately. And I'll tell you, I'm not sure, to be honest, that I think organizations like NRDC really can do true environmental justice work. We'll talk about this on Wednesday, but we are a signatory to the Jemez principles, which is, sort of the underlying agreements to community groups that were engaged in the environmental justice movement. And, the idea is that you are centering and leading your clients first. But when we bring suits, NRDC is a membership-based organization. We often bring suits on behalf of our own organization. That's actually the traditional modeling. And we're not a law firm, so we don't ever bring a suit, if ever, very rarely, on just behalf of an outside organization. So NRDC always has an interest, and NRDC is not a monolith, and we have a lot of issues. It's such a huge juggernaut of an organization with so many issues that sometimes there's a lot of conflict that may arise. So ethically, we also have to be really careful with that. But anyway, to answer your question, it was just sort of learning on the job, really. Yeah. Yes.
So you talked a little bit about, working within and then working without. So being surrounded by people who could all agree with you, and then also going to a space where you might be the sole or one of only a few voices that are pushing for some sort of social justice effort, whether it's internal or external. And have you found any good strategies for doing that? Like if you were in the private sector, but you were working on trying to do internal and external changes, and how that was different from being, not that an echo chamber is necessarily a bad thing, but being surrounded by people who were like, yes, you're correct.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I'm sure many of us even face this challenge, not in the workplace, but even with our families, like family members who may not agree with the way we see things. I think that creating a safe space for understanding other people's point of views is so important. I'm very guilty of this. Like sometimes I get so mad that I can't even my mom's here, she knows. I get so mad that I can't listen sometimes. And I think when we're engaging on issues that of equity and discrimination, we want to be in a place where we are first and foremost listening and understanding. And I think it's the same principles that apply when you go into a community to try to understand their issues, right? Where are you? What's your lived experience like? How is this affecting you on a day-to-day basis? Why do you feel this way? And I think that when you're working, let's say, in a law firm where people are not necessarily sharing your viewpoint, I think it's being empowered to actually raise the questions is appropriate, and then sometimes maybe stepping back, and then maybe raising it again later, and then stepping back. I mean, you sort of have to figure out what's your style and what's going to be least off-putting to people who may not agree with you at all. I hope that answers the question. Thanks. Yes.
Talking about the funding that's available to larger organizations versus smaller organizations, what paths do you see for reallocating those resources and kind of providing a more equitable method of representation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually something NRDC grapples with on a regular basis. We recently received something like $100 million from Jeff Bezos, which is publicly made. Yeah, it's radical to spend in 3 years. I think that one thing is a commitment by the organizations to say, this is what we are committed to doing, and this is the percentage of money that we are willing and we are intending to share with community groups in terms of re-granting. Now, re-granting has its own limitations, and some of my colleagues sort of really jump into this quite, in a lot of detail. Re-granting can almost, you're sort of serving as a middleman in terms of being a foundation or a funder, right? But some organizations like NRDC make commitments to sharing some percentage of whatever money that they're coming so that it's going to frontline communities. And I think any organization that you work for that gets some significant amount of funds, I think it's important to kind of engage in those conversations, to ask those questions. How much of this percentage, just like the federal government now with Justice 40, like how much of this percentage of the funds that we have that are coming to us are going to be regranted to groups, not just used for our purpose to help those groups, but to actually be given to those groups. Those groups can use those funds in whatever way they would like to do that. Yeah, there's actually a lot written on this topic, and if you are interested in it, I would encourage you to look into it because it's like a pretty, I think it's a pretty cutting edge issue for sure.
Thank you.
Yes.
With the work in Flint, you were talking a lot about the burden of knowing that NRDC wouldn't be there forever, and that's really hard thing to grapple with when you're building community relationships. Was there anything done to like empower in like a legal sense folks that stayed there and create that agency more so?
Yeah, I should have mentioned, and I'm sorry that I didn't, that at the time in the early stages of the case that I couldn't say for sure that we were going to be there, but NRDC has actually committed tons of resources into Michigan and into Flint in particular, with like staffers who are like more on the ground, who are located there. So I'm sorry if I didn't say that, but I really should have because they've done an incredible amount of work there. In terms of the empowerment, the main issue is sort of leading, again, like having the community speak for itself and lead for itself in terms of what it needs. We've done a lot of partnership with various groups in Flint beyond just the litigation itself. And I think that's just been one way where we are strategically thinking about ways to support in multiple different areas, not just this one particular issue, which is just, the Flint water crisis. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
When you were changing lanes,
Yes.
how did you decide which specific organizations to move into?
Well, I wish that I could say that I just like had a choice of like, well, I'm going to go here now and I'm going to go here. That isn't what happened for me. I will say that in deciding my next career moves, I kind of engaged in, every single time I engaged in sort of a deliberate thinking process. When I left legal services, I wanted to be a lawyer, I wanted to do impact stuff. When I left ACLU, I wanted litigation skills. When I left, the law firm, I wanted to get back into public interest work. So I think for me, what's very helpful is sort of making a list of like, what is the next thing that I feel I like to learn a lot. I think intellectually curious about a lot of different things. So I like to kind of understand what is the next thing that will help me advance personally, professionally, intellectually, and what does that list look like? And then start looking at organizations and different types of fields. And then I start talking to people because there's so many people doing so many different things, and I think that like opportunities out there are also really significant, even in terms of like the tech sector. And I hate to say it, but there's a lot of options out there in terms of doing work that might be outside of the traditional public interest modeling. So I think kind of understanding what is it that you're looking for next, and then trying to figure out like who's in that space, who's occupying that space, who are the leaders, who are not the leaders, who are the people that should be supported, where is the need the highest, and consider looking at it that way.
One more question.
Okay. Yes.
You had mentioned working on Flint crisis before it became a national news story. I'm just curious if there are any issues you're working on today within the realm of EJ that may not be kind of within the mind of the public consciousness. We may not be aware of today that you're working on.
Yeah, no. So I currently am not advocating formally. I'm in a like really serious management role. And I think this is why I'm like, okay, what am I doing next? I really like it, but I support, the work that I'm doing right now is really internal facing. So I support our team and our organization around issues, to the extent that it relates to issues of equity and justice. That includes like thinking strategically about where we're allocating resources, where we're doing staffing, where we're, thinking about growing. And so that kind of internal facing work is sort of where my brain has been spending a lot of its time most recently. So yeah, sorry that isn't like a sexy answer, but it is what it is. It's honest.
I just want to thank you so much.
Great.
Anjali, for if not, I'm able to actually turn on your side. I think this works. No, I'll just speak up. I've not seen a room packed like this. This is amazing. So I think that speaks to how interested we all are in Anjali's incredible career. I encourage you, if you haven't already signed up for a one-to-one meeting, there's a few more slots tomorrow and Wednesday. Take a look at the sign-up link that was in the Weekly Wire. And please come to our Wednesday roundtable, Anjali's Wednesday roundtable, which is in this room as well. Same time, we have Newsell's own Professor Emeritus Lee Breckenridge moderating. Sophia Owen from Conservation Law Foundation, from ACE, Alternatives for Community Development, Sophia Owen, Stacy Rubin from Conservation Law Foundation, and Newsell's own Deborah Jackson from the Center for Law, Equity, and Race, so it should be a really dynamic conversation.
And Sophia and Stacy both work at local environmental justice organizations here in the area, so I think it's even more interesting to hear because we all come to this work from really different places. So I think it'll just be a really rich conversation about what environmental justice work is.
And they're Newsell alum as well, so
Yeah.
go Newsell. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you all.